Some folks want to get into business for themselves right out of the gate in industries where they've got no experience. And in some cases, those are smashing successes and home runs.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it. Welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm excited to have my host today, Steve Raeder. He's the CEO and founder of Summit Ridge. Steve, if you could briefly talk about your company and your background. I think it's, really interesting. Obviously, you came from SunEdison and basically was the managing director of the Northeast Business Development. And then you decided to start your own company that's both a developer and investor.
Yep.
And then you obviously have other entrepreneurial experiences. So I'm excited to have you on the show. And I appreciate Garen, who works at Summit Ridge, for recommending you to be on the podcast. So
Garen Bischoff, yes.
Anyone who's interested in being on the podcast, feel free to reach out to us on info@Reneu Energy. It's interesting because I knew Garen back when he was at SunEdison, and he always would tell me that he had great experience, even back then, which is like maybe 4 years ago, how he had great experiences working with you. So
Garen called me when he was in South Africa to inform me at a certain point that he was moving from the SunEdison South African business unit to North America, and that I needed to make a role for him on the team. So,
by the way, he had a conversation about it to me because I think his wife was moving to New York for her job, and he wanted to be a part of SunEdison.
That's right.
And then he targeted you. I think he told me he cold called you actually
many times, but he eventually worked his way in.
That's a great story.
Came over to the Summit Ridge team early. He's a valuable member of the team, yeah.
And as Steve calls him, the nicest guy.
The nicest man in solar. Nicest guy in solar, for sure.
Yeah,
the friendliest.
Definitely the friendliest. And Garen and I actually met at a Vote Solar event.
That's right.
In Brooklyn. And him and I were, of course, the last people who were out and about in Brooklyn after this event. And that's how...
He's an optimist. We need that in this space, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he's always... Well, there's a lot of reason to be optimistic in our space, but it's always good to have somebody that's naturally like that. So
definitely. And obviously, Garen and I had a connection as well because I used to work at Solar City, which was founded by Lyndon and Peter Rive, and then Elon, who are from South Africa, and Garen's from South Africa. But sorry to go into this sort of discourse, but we really do appreciate Garen's actually an avid listener of the podcast. He thought Steve would be great. And when he recommended Steve, I was excited because I think Steve really brings a unique perspective. It would be great to kind of hear what you do at Summit Ridge and your background before.
Yeah, for sure. Have been in the space doing this for, over a decade at this point, which I always tell people feels like dog years. It feels more like 70 plus years. It's all I've ever done. But it's been great. It's been great to be in the space when modules were, I can't even remember,
$1.80 maybe?
$2.50 a watt or whatever it was, all the way down to 40 cents, high 30s where we are now. Precipitous drop in cost across the entire supply chain, and in balance of system, inverters, racking, modules, obviously first and foremost, which is
and
really
then the efficiency.
The efficiency, absolutely, getting more juice from the same footprint. So exciting times to be in the space. Still an exciting time. I'm a believer in the inevitability of what we're doing. The industry is in many ways unstoppable despite the complexity that we deal with on a daily basis. It's funny, I get asked by relatives occasionally if I'm still selling or installing solar panels on people's houses, and I just say yes. I just leave it at that. It's too difficult to kind of describe the soup to nuts, the start to finish process, and what we do is an arduous one, but it's well worth it. The end game is
definitely
the end product, I should say.
Yeah, definitely. That's helpful to know. I think one thing that would be helpful too, and I know we talked about before the podcast interview, obviously there's been challenges with solar, but there's a lot of opportunity as well. There's been fits and starts. You've been on the solar roller coaster for now 10 years. Can you talk about why it's great to be optimistic? It's been challenging because we've needed federal incentives and state level incentives to make the project work. So it's complex. And can you talk about both the pros and cons?
And in many cases, we still do need those incentives, but the need is dwindling. And when I said the inevitability, I think there's a time called the next 10 years where this is the cheapest resource in just about every U.S. market without any kind of subsidy. That's exciting, right?
That's really exciting.
It's really exciting. And I think our industry at times loses sight of that because of the challenges that we face, the complexity of building these things. Building a 2 megawatt AC project in the middle of the field is a complicated process that requires, one to go through an entire kind of entitlement and permitting process and structuring finance and, making sure that incentives are obtained at the programmatic level. The development complexities I don't see going away ever entirely. I think that the process gets more efficient, but certainly the structuring of the finance, as soon as the tax equity is set to step down, the need for state level incentives will continue to decline. And I've witnessed that over the past 10 years. So the markets that have opened up, the availability of solar power, not just to big commercial customers anymore, but to the ratepayer, to residential customers,
Sure.
i.e. community solar, which is really has taken over the C&I industry. It's the way things are headed in almost all of these new C&I markets that are opening up, and in existing C&I markets. It's where things have been moving.
And can you talk about how is Summit Ridge different from other players in the market? What you guys focus on? I know you've been focused a lot on community solar, and you get involved from early stages with the landowner to partnering with developers in a co-development arrangement.
Many of us, I think we intimately understand community. When I say community, I mean projects who have a majority of the offtake comprised of residential customers, right? That's in our speak is community solar, which is new. You're facing FICO credit as opposed to, a Moody's or an SMP credit rating that, your typical investment grade commercial customer has. And those IG customers were the ones that were really the only ones that were serving as offtake to these projects. Not the only, but the vast majority for the past several years. Community opens that up to the residential ratepayer. So I think we really understand the community space intimately. And that goes back to my roots and some of my partners' roots at SunEdison, where we've been working on this for years. We've been able to attract folk from other organizations as well. As you know, I came from SunEdison. I left the business unit post-bankruptcy, decided not to go with the business unit through the bankruptcy process, which ultimately sold to a Japanese buyer. Really happy that I did so and was able to bring folks over from other shops to kind of create our own brand and identity, our own culture, with a lot of that being lessons learned from SunEdison and what to do and what not to do, but also knowing that I needed to inject some fresh blood from other places.
Definitely. And can you talk about your background before SunEdison as well? Because I think that's interesting, and it would be great. You talked about some of the positives and negatives. Can you talk about too, what happened to SunEdison? Maybe not all our listeners, what we call mavericks. No, I know most people in the solar industry know about it, but I think it would be helpful to talk about your journey, what made you passionate about solar, and I think that would be helpful because our show is about entrepreneurship, and it's interesting to hear some of the reasons why you started your own company. So
I years ago had my own sales consultancy that really catered to that mission critical infrastructure space. I came out of the data center world.
Interesting.
And was fortunate to have some really strong clients, interesting clients. Verizon was one, did some work for James Lee Wood Associates, which I think has been rebranded since, but James Lee was the head of FEMA under the Clinton administration. And I met a guy named Scott Sklar, which I think a lot of folks in the industry know who Scott is. Scott's been doing a lot of work in the DOE, actually the Department of Defense front for many years. Scott came in and talked about distributed generation and the benefits to national security from a resiliency standpoint. So shoring up mission critical infrastructure and power outage events. I thought it made a ton of sense. It was intriguing. My brother and I at the time started to roll up our sleeves and really started to understand the economics of the space. Built a handful of small systems kind of regionally, almost as a side project, and then eventually got hooked up. And I don't even remember how, with SunEdison back in the 2009 timeframe. But SunEd at the time was a much smaller organization with big visions and with some really smart people that went far. The collapse is what it's known for, but some of the most capable folks in the industry came out of SunEd. It was time well spent for sure. It was a lesson in how to scale in this space and creativity. I think a lot of the current contractual structures and things that you see in the marketplace with virtual structures, remote structures where folks are building systems 30 miles away from the entities that are buying the power. A lot of that originated, I feel like, with SunEdison, but also lessons in what not to do.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty interesting to hear your story. And then you basically became managing director of origination in the Northeast. I know you worked too.
I was the managing director, but then I became the general manager of the East Coast commercial business, C&I business for SunEd. Yep.
And I remember when we first started talking a few years ago, you were doing a lot at the time with Massachusetts, I think, in the SREC.
Was doing a lot of work.
Program.
We did a lot of work in Massachusetts. Yeah, we probably developed and were acquired, upwards of, call it 80 to 100 megawatts in the state, most of which got built. And that's a super stable program, or it is now. I think it was less so then, but Massachusetts is one of the stronger solar markets in the country. Massachusetts has done a great job of learning from its subsequent programs, previous, I should say, and kind of building off that and listening to developers within the industry. And I think what we see now in the SMART program is, one of the better incentive constructs, one of the better incentive programs in the C&I space.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that's huge. With basically, it's essentially almost like a feed-in tariff program where you're contracted with the utility for a certain period of time. And it was interesting to me that at that point with SREC 1 that you guys were aggressive because a lot of people weren't sure. And that was like right after the New Jersey market collapsed and there was an artificial price floor that the Massachusetts DOER created. So I remember when I was first met you and we were introduced by
Was it called the minimum standard formula?
I remember that, to basically fix oversupply.
Yeah.
So then you adjust the demand. I remember spending many hours trying to understand that calculation and talking to Mike Judge. But I thought it was really interesting at the time that you guys were extremely bullish on that because it became a very lucrative incentive and people weren't at that time very sure. So it was interesting, when
we were aggressive and not as much within the C&I business unit. I will almost call it more creative. The company was aggressive and ultimately probably too much so, but not within the commercial business. I think we were fortunate to have a lot of smart folks that were at the leading edge of the industry and contractual constructs and financing solutions that have since been repeated many times.
Definitely.
What I've seen in the industry is that finance gets comfortable over time, right? You saw the tax equity and lenders start to get comfortable with SREC markets. I think Massachusetts went a long way towards righting the issues that had happened in New Jersey. The Massachusetts DOER looked at what happened in New Jersey and took great lengths to kind of put a program in place that was different and that was more stable, that was easier to underwrite. And, we've seen that kind of come all the way to the SMART program where it's definitely one of the easiest markets to finance. But the industry, the financing community, project finance has a way of getting comfortable with structures over time. It just takes some time. Community solar is no different than that. Sure. Underwriting FICO score instead of investment grade commercial entities is something that certain lenders are going to be more comfortable with versus others. We found that lenders who have more distinct experience in that kind of residential or co-op space are ahead of the curve as opposed to some of your traditional lenders in the space. But it'll come around. It'll come around. And as financing options become more numerous in the space, you'll see more and more community built. We know we're ready. We're developing community assets ourselves in multiple markets, and we're acquiring from other developers in multiple markets.
Sure. And can you talk about what states you prefer to develop projects?
We're heavy in the Maryland market right now. That wasn't planned necessarily, but being based in Arlington, Virginia, and being a Maryland guy, and a few of our folks live in Maryland, it's our backyard. It makes sense. It's easier for us to support. We've got 3 projects under construction now. We've got a number of rooftop projects. We co-developed what I think is the largest all-residential project yet.
Oh, wow.
On a landfill in Maryland that's set to reach COD here, we think, in the next 30 days or so. So Maryland has been a big market for us. We're active in New York. You and I were talking about Raeder. I've got the old Raeder rate stack up here on the whiteboard.
We're in Summit Ridge's beautiful office in Arlington, Virginia, and I was laughing because they have a whole sort of breakdown of Raeder. And if you're not familiar, it's a value of distributed energy resources that New York has, and there's a couple of different components. I know we were talking about the DRV, which changes after 2 years, LMP, which is, so basically it's a very different program and it's a lot more complicated because you have these different components and these different components can be variable, which makes it completely challenging. And I don't know if this podcast is the best place
Probably
to
not.
go into
We're going to lose
detail.
everybody if we get into that right now.
Yeah. But it seems like you guys are actively looking in New York.
We've played in New York for a long time. We developed a large R&M portfolio. That was kind of the previous 2 programs ago. We had built a big portfolio there, so we understand the market. Not that the R&M program was the Raeder program.
Definitely.
That's probably its own separate podcast. But New York's a market that we're in. We're actively taking land positions in select markets like New Jersey, which you and I were talking about earlier, more limited in scale. The Illinois lottery for the adjustable block program is set to occur here on Wednesday of this week. So we've got dozens of projects that we submitted. So fingers crossed, we'll see what gets picked. That was one of the more, I'll call it, interesting programs that we've ever kind of played in. But again, fingers crossed. I think it'll turn out okay. Illinois is poised to, I think, look back and learn from the program that's in place today and do something a lot better and more robust here on a go-forward basis. So I'm pretty optimistic that's going to happen.
Definitely. And I think your brother's based in the Midwest as well.
He's
and
in Chicago, yep.
And you guys have an office as well in Chicago and New York outside of your primary office here in Arlington, Virginia.
We do. Absolutely.
You briefly touched on it. The reason why you're focused on New Jersey is New Jersey has the community solar pilot, which is basically 75 megawatts per year. I know we were both talking before the podcast that it could be challenging because it's such a small program, but you guys have been looking at land opportunities there.
We're looking at land. We've been looking at roofs.
Roofs as well.
It's small. I think that's a program that's set to grow as well.
Sure.
New Jersey, was for a time there the leader on the East Coast. And I think there's a desire to kind of take their place back as one of the leading markets from an installation standpoint. So we're excited. New Jersey's been somewhat dormant for, that's not to say that systems haven't been being built on a monthly basis. I know that's still the case, but, compared to markets like Massachusetts, they've kind of lost ground.
Yeah, definitely. That is huge. Have you looked at Pennsylvania? I know Pennsylvania has a community solar pilot that came out 2 or 3 weeks ago. Is that something? Or is it too early?
I don't know if that the program's final yet, but yes,
not final,
Pennsylvania is a market that we're very interested in. I mean, this, Benoy, these it's a fight to get these programs passed at the state level, right? We just saw New Mexico went down in flames there at the 11th hour. I don't think that it's permanently dead, but it's on ice for at least now. I think we were hopeful that something could get done in Nevada. It didn't quite happen.
Definitely.
So there's a lot of start-stop in the industry. I think over time we'll see it become a more widely accepted, even in regulated markets. We'll see solar become more widely accepted. It already is, but you'll see community programs open up. And I think that's on a go-forward basis, not the only way, but the highest likelihood of new incentive programs making it through any type of state legislature is they got to include the ratepayer. You've got to let the residents participate.
Definitely, and I think it's huge because you're basically, instead of going wholesale, you're able to get some sort of discount to the residential rate, which potentially makes the projects more attractive.
You're able to sell these, what amounts to monetary credits, to residential customers remotely. So for some of the listeners, we're not physically installing solar on a person's rooftop. They're buying the solar power remotely, which I think if given the chance, most people prefer. I may eat my words on that, but I think that's the truth. It's the truth.
So, yeah. That's a great point. And can you talk about, too, like some of the challenges really with community solar as well? We were talking about it before the podcast, is like the acquisition of customers, management. There's a lot of, companies coming out there who are saying they're experts at acquiring community solar. It seems like the costs seem to be pretty high to acquire these customers. Like, what's been your sort of experience?
Yeah.
Because you guys actually own projects or part of projects as well.
we do. And on a go-forward basis here, the second phase of Summit Ridge is set to launch here in the next handful of weeks, where I'm excited we'll be owning and operating all the systems we develop or acquire on a go-forward basis. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes on that, so more on that soon. But look, everybody talks about community, right? Community. It's the buzzword in the industry right now. When it comes down to it, there just haven't been that many projects with residential customers serving as the offtake. There haven't been that many projects built. So some of the challenges have been numerous. One is on the financing front, right?
Yeah.
So getting more so lenders
comfortable.
If you look, you and I know that the primary portions of the capital stack really there's three. There's tax equity, there's cash equity, and there's debt. Most cash equity investors are looking for levered returns, and there are a handful of lenders, more than a handful, that have been operating the space for years. Once you introduce residential customers into the mix, we found that many of the permanent lenders, debt providers, have been reticent. It's just new. It's too new.
Definitely.
It's facing FICO score instead of kind of investment grade commercial entities. So great strides over the past, I would almost say 18 months in particular, almost 12 months, but really great strides on the debt front. We've got a great partner that we're excited to be working with here. I think tax equity, there's a handful of players that have gotten comfortable with the space and have been for quite some time. And tax equity is largely out of the deal in 5-6 years, so it's a little bit different. And then just getting cash equity investors comfortable that you're going to have X number of residential customers on a system. And those customers that are there day one won't be the same customers necessarily that are there in year 10, right? There's going to be churn for multiple reasons. There'll be default. Folks move, folks die, things happen. So getting the capital stack comfortable with community solar has been a challenge, but I think we're there. That's number one. And then two is the sourcing of the customers, these aggregators. A lot of them are smaller entities, just like, the development community is largely comprised of smaller developers. The ones that we've worked with have a lot of talent. They're very good at going out and sourcing customers, but there are smaller entities that can be harder to underwrite. And that's it's a marriage of sorts, right? Because these solar contracts, or the life of the system, is kind of 20 to 35 year horizon, right? And a lot of the incentive programs that are in place are upwards of 20 years. So the notion is that you'll have residential customers in some cases and commercial customers, but you'll have that residential customer buying the power derivative in the form of a net metering credit. They'll be buying that over a long term. So you've got to partner with somebody that's going to be in the deal for a minimum several years, right?
Definitely.
I don't think we've signed a 20-year contract, but you're not just signing a 1-year contract. I think there'll be consolidation in that space eventually. You and I were talking about this. Yes. Utilities are really the natural fit for that role.
Definitely.
Depending on the market, that could come sooner rather than later. And then in other markets, I think it's going to come later.
Sure, yeah, definitely, that makes sense. And also,
some of the utilities, by the way,
sure,
they know it's an opportunity. Some of the utilities that we work with in the deregulated markets understand that it's an opportunity.
Yeah,
they already control the customer.
Definitely,
there's a stickiness factor there. They can upsell the customer. So it's just it could be, and it is in some cases, viewed as a compelling kind of additional revenue stream that they could earn.
Yeah, then as well, they have the experience managing the customer. Then it's easier for the customer for everything to be on one bill.
Yep.
So that's pretty interesting as well. And you mentioned about Maryland. I know in the community solar pilot, there's a LMI, a low income component to it.
There is, and I said this earlier. Most of these new incentive programs that are making it through the various state legislatures have a community component with residential customers, but there's also a carve out for LMI, as frankly I think there should be.
Yeah.
Maryland has a carve out in terms of capacity that's allocated for those customers.
Sure.
There's no additional incentives. Other markets will provide an additional incentive to help with the underwriting process.
Definitely.
I haven't gone as deep as I want to and I need to at some point, but I think there's some really compelling data out there that says that LMI customers are every bit as likely to make the payment on a monthly basis because it's meaningful. It's meaningful savings. The Posigen guys, I think, have been at the forefront of that space for a long time and have some. I remember hearing their CEO had some data points that were really compelling. So there is an LMI component in multiple markets. We've kind of started to embrace that, and it's something that we plan on incorporating into our development activities here.
Definitely. And it seems like, as you said, more community solar programs are including an LMI component. Like this new program in New Jersey, the pilot, has an LMI component as well. And then we were talking about that my company were developing on the New York Housing Authority, and part of it that the New York Housing Authority is requiring that there's an LMI component for the basic subscription into the program. So it's interesting. It seems, everyone wants a program that, and specifically politicians as well, where everyone has access to it, not just certain residential customers based on FICO score.
Yeah, for sure. Mass was kind of first there, right? We probably signed up 14, 15 different housing authorities. My team did while at Sun Edison because the Massachusetts, the SREC 2 program incentivized that.
Yeah, definitely.
And made a real impact. Yeah. And it was all remotely sited for the most part, right? Because there's physical constraints in any major urban area for the most part,
Definitely.
or where we struggle to find land in New York City, for instance, just like we did in Boston, just like you do in Fall River, just like you do in New Bedford and folks that we worked with in the past. So being able to build, a 3 megawatt system, call it, miles away, and then sell the power contractually was just a huge benefit.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like you guys are in the forefront because I feel like a lot of people haven't been really thinking about that, and you've been involved since day one with the SREC 2 program.
Yeah, so we've been trying. It again, like you said, it's a growing component. Most of these markets really is.
Yeah, and one of my questions is what trends are you seeing in solar? I know we talked about some trends, but specifically in community solar, talking about LMI, residential offtake. Obviously, there'll be a time, which you mentioned, which is a great point about grid parity, where we're not dependent on incentives going forward. Is there any other, storage? I know
storage mentioned. That's the low hanging fruit, right? That's I think most of these programs are incorporating storage. Most of these programs at the state level, I should say, are incorporating some form of storage incentive, as they should, for multiple reasons. It makes all the sense of the world. There's that the dispatchability of storage compared to solar modules, which are intermittent resources,
Sure.
which work during the day. You've got to be able to save the power. The systems aren't working at night. And then there's ancillary service markets. There's a whole host of other reasons why incorporating storage makes sense and will continue to make sense on a go-forward basis. At SunEdison, my team, and this is something we've looked into here at Summit Ridge, we submitted, I think, 30 megawatts into the forward capacity,
Sure.
ISO New England forward capacity market, and achieved additional revenue from the systems that way, while being able to participate in an ancillary service market that satisfied a real need at the market level. So I think there's some interesting go-forward opportunities with ancillary services. I think there's a way to kind of design these systems on a go-forward basis to take advantage of some future opportunities, some future repowering opportunities.
Definitely. That's a great point.
And then contractual structures continue to evolve. I'd like to think that the opportunity in the near term is that just flat out new markets will open up, right?
Yeah,
That
definitely.
this stuff will be allowed in down south, for instance, and
Sure.
the regulated utilities will start to embrace it more. Not that they have it in their own way, right?
Yeah.
Duke's a great example. In North Carolina
Definitely.
is second or third biggest solar market in the U.S. Most folks don't know that.
Yeah.
They've had a super stable program forever. Georgia Power's been
Sure,
been an
with their
active participant.
solicitations, yeah.
But there are certain markets that just flat out there's no real opportunity at this point.
Yeah.
One would hope that would change. Florida keeps coming to mind, right?
Yeah.
Wait.
Florida seems like it's slowly changing.
Yeah. Feels like it might be.
Florida Power and Light has really kind of controlled the market and really hasn't allowed solar, and PPAs were illegal and they're not, I think, anymore. So
maybe that I should know that, but I don't.
I mean, the problem is, right, what makes it so complicated, every state is so unique. When you talk about a community solar program in Massachusetts, it's totally different than what's in Maryland or New Jersey. And then even
100%,
within
yeah.
utility zones in the same state, to understand all the policy that's happening, it's just, you need like a whole team of people to
You do.
kinda-
I mean, regulatory affairs folks are invaluable in our space, and most of the larger developers have someone on staff that's kind of advocating for that developer's position within the market, but also staying on top of the proposed programmatic legislation, or making sure
Sure.
that programs continue or expand. That's something that we engage external resources for. It's super valuable. And I don't mean this in the wrong way, but hopefully at some point that won't be as valuable,
Oh,
because this
definitely.
stuff just gets easier and it's less dependent on both state and Fed incentives. That's the game. That's the end game, right?
That's what we're all waiting for, because then
That's what we're all waiting for, man.
yeah, then it's exponential to another level, even though, the growth of the industry.
It's getting
has
there. I mean,
been-
some of these all-in costs that I hear about down, particularly down south, on these utility scale plants, it's amazing. It's
Yeah.
well under $1.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing. I don't think 10 years ago or any of these research companies would have projected total bill cost, below $1 a watt, which is pretty amazing.
It's
to
pretty
kinda see.
amazing. When I say utility scale, I mean you're in that range of kind of the 5 to 10 meg, depending on which market you're at, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the cost of labor. So exciting.
It's definitely very exciting. Kind of to switch gears a little bit, you talked about your story, and before SunEdison, you had your own company. And then obviously now Summit Ridge. This podcast is about entrepreneurship. Can you talk about what's made you want to become an entrepreneur? You talked a little bit about why you started Summit Ridge. And can you talk about anyone who's thinking about being an entrepreneur, what suggestions
Sure.
would you have for them?
In both cases, I felt like I had been in the space, the market, for many years. I had been in the data center, kind of that mission critical space for years. This is going way back, and felt like I could do what I was doing for my former company on a standalone basis, and felt like I had the legs to stand on. And then really particularly so, and that was in my 20s, post kind of being in the business for several years, and at SunEdison for 6 or 7 years, really had a high degree of confidence that with the right folks, we could apply lessons learned and do it our way. Mm-hmm. Without getting into specifics, there was a lot of things that I saw that could be improved upon, or flat out kind of reverse engineered and put back together a better way where we could ultimately wind up with a better product, and we could fulfill our commitments to our clients and our investors in a better way. So my advice would be that know your space. And I think the timing is somewhat natural. Some folks want to get into the business for themselves right out of the gate in industries where they've got no experience. And in some cases, those are smashing successes and home runs, innovation, right? New technologies. In more established industries, which I would dare say that the crazy solar industry is at this point, having that comprehensive understanding of the space came with time, to where there was a comfort level that I knew what I wanted to do, and I thought I knew how to do it. And knock on wood, I think we're doing an okay job. It's Summit Ridge. One of those lessons learned, by the way, is to kind of stay small, right? You can do a lot in this space. You don't need 95 bodies or 200 bodies. Kind of lived that game and saw that one of the hallmarks of this industry is that your burn is always a few steps ahead of inflows, and that's just kind of business 101, right? With the right folks, you can do good things in this space without having to staff up to 100 bodies. So the goal here is to kind of stay below that 30 employee threshold for the foreseeable future. We're under 20 now. We've got to staff up a little bit. We've got some holes that we've got to fill, but that's a good thing. That's because of increased work, increased project level work.
That's great to hear. And by the way, I've lived it as well, working at previous solar companies, the churn and the burn, and then the challenge that, you were kind of alluding to in the development game. It takes a long time to kind of build these projects, and from initial sort of site selection to negotiating with the landowner, permitting, interconnection.
Lumpy.
Very lumpy. And, most developers get paid mostly at notice to proceed, which is basically construction ready, or COD, depending on the milestones and what's negotiated. So you could be talking about a year and a half, 2 years, which...
We used to talk about a flow business.
I've heard about this flow, by the way. I heard this at another...
Flow business was the solar development. Unfortunately, is not so much a flow business.
No, definitely.
There are things you can do to fill in the gaps. I think having a nice mix of both ground mount and rooftop projects, for instance, behind the meter projects and in front of the meter virtual projects is a good mix, and that the peaks and valleys aren't too far apart from one another. But there are things that happen that are outside of any developer's control that you've got to take into account. And so when there are a lot of mouths to feed, and when there are folks that are sitting on the bench kind of in between portfolio development activities, that's been the death knell for many a solar company, I feel like.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We've seen it, especially, too, when you talk about the national players, because it feels like the regional developers have a competitive advantage because they have relationships, and people are like...
That's right.
It's all about relationships at the end. And I thought it was interesting because you initially, before you were in solar, worked for a data center company, and then you kind of had your own thing, which data centers are obviously an ideal location for solar.
We've looked at a number of data centers. Most data centers don't want panels on their roofs for a variety of reasons. And a lot of the larger data centers that service co-location facilities or hosting facilities that have excess land have kind of different things in mind from a master planning standpoint. They want to build additional facilities.
Yeah.
So data centers, we're actually talking to a large data center right now actually about selling power, but via
corporate PPA.
Via corporate PPA, via a synthetic PPA, where we're selling from an offsite located system, or frankly systems plural. In fact, we're talking this one data center about selling upwards of the output from a couple dozen solar farms.
Oh, interesting.
Just to give you an idea of the power usage. So great application there.
Yes.
And by the way, you're starting to see more of those power wheeling type contracts where you're injecting at one node and managing your basis risk, and power's coming out at another node, and then you're going to a third party supplier like a direct and having them kind of manage the accounts being applied to the PJM sub account or whatever it may be. Those kind of synthetic corporate PPAs are becoming
contract
more contract for differences. Exactly. Yeah. Some in Virginia, I think AWS.
Yeah, AWS has been doing a lot of that because they have the 100% renewable energy goals, and then they've been working with Dominion predominantly on having those sort of corporate PPAs.
A lot of utility development in Virginia.
Oh, it's amazing. It's tons. Yeah, I'm actually speaking at a conference tomorrow in Virginia, in Richmond, about landfill, brownfield development on solar. And if you do research on the Virginia market, a lot of everything's pretty much developers are selling land opportunities basically mostly to Dominion. And then Dominion's basically acting as the go-between, because to get these data centers and all the data center construction, not just with Amazon and Facebook and Microsoft, Dominion's basically saying we'll make sure that you have 100% renewables, and they don't want like a rec. Obviously, they want
Right.
Some
Right.
sort of corporate PPA offsite. So it's interesting.
It's our home state, man. We got to turn around and start doing some more things in Virginia. We've started to talk about it a lot internally. Most everything we do is kind of at that distribution level.
Yeah,
Stayed away from transmission. Utility scale projects just because of the size of the organization and the goal and where our focus has been, right? With community, true community. We've got
Definitely.
residential customers. That's not to say that there won't be community programs that pop up in the South, because I think we're already starting to see it.
Yeah.
It may be sleeved through the utility, but,
Sure.
I think there's actually a couple of the Florida co-ops have programs similar to what I just described.
interesting. Yeah, like if Virginia has like their new energy master plan, they have big goals for renewables, and then I think DE Shaw signed some sort of agreement with the cooperative to basically they provided a long-term PPA, and DE Shaw is going to own. I forget how many megawatts it was, but it's interesting.
System built in Virginia?
In Virginia,
Okay.
system built in Virginia, yeah. So it's interesting to kind of see that. I think that's going to be a continued trend. Virginia is just an ideal place, it seems like, for data centers and and AWS plans on building a lot. And obviously, Amazon has their second corporate
That's
headquarters
right, over here in Crystal City,
in
right?
Crystal City. So it seems like they're very invested in there.
For sure.
So,
Yeah. That's,
Definitely.
we're right here in Roslyn right now as
Yeah,
we speak.
seriously.
Watch the planes flying over behind you here.
it's pretty amazing. I mean, this is a beautiful building and location. You guys are like in the ideal.
This is beautiful Class C office space is what I would call it. Thanks, Benoy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. It was pretty cool actually coming with the big logo. And you guys did a great job with the office. And
Yeah, man, that's like the solar developers. We try to keep it lean.
Lean.
That sign though was I think took a few months, but that's probably the nicest thing we have in here.
yeah, that is pretty impressive.
This is the building where the whole Watergate deep
Oh, you were
throat
telling me
interview
about
happened. Yeah, in
this
the garage.
actually. Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
So it's a
History.
historical landmark. You were telling me this when we were hanging out in
It's
San
historical.
Diego
Yeah.
at the happy
That's
hour.
the claim to fame of this building. This was Class A office space in the 70s. But It was
Yeah.
a while ago, though. It was a while ago.
Well, hey, as you
We
said,
might be moving. We're growing. We're moving up the street.
well, I think the good thing, which is really important, is it seems like you guys are very about adding value and building a great team, and not having a big overhead, which allows you to be nimble. And then
Yeah, you mentioned some of the regional developers that I've been working with for years, right? Blue Wave, awesome shop, right? These guys are, and one of the reasons why they're so good is they've just focused in a couple of markets and primarily one, Massachusetts. And they understand it intimately, are involved at the regulatory construct level, programmatic construct level, and they've had a steady business for years. Never really a national player that was ever up at Sun Edison or Solar City or SunPower level, but you see folks like that at the regional level who've done well for a long time because they've done it right. So that there are other examples of folks out there who have kind of grown on a measured basis and have really dove into a handful of select markets. It's tough to be everything to everybody in the space.
Oh, definitely. That's a great point.
It is. You got to navigate the ups and the downs. So it has been cyclical. I see it. The runway is growing longer and longer, and things are becoming more predictable. I say that just as the tariffs hit us last year, right? That was like a club to the back of the head for a lot of us.
Definitely.
Folks didn't see it coming, but hopefully there's no more big surprises like that. And as the cost structure continues to drop, I don't think we're going to see it precipitously drop the way we have over the past several years, but the construction process is getting more efficient.
Definitely. That's a
Modules
great
will
point.
continue to drop somewhat in cost, and efficiency will continue to increase. It just becomes more predictable, right? As those incentives are less and less required, this thing becomes unstoppable. Right?
Definitely. The future is bright for solar. It's just exciting.
I think so. You hear it shouldn't be political, right? And
It shouldn't
I
be,
think
no.
the cost structure, and whenever you're able to offer power at levels equal to or less than the kind of incumbent utility, when there's little to no incentives, I wouldn't expect that we'll see any pushback. I mean, you don't markets where that's currently the case.
Definitely.
So I'm an optimist when it comes to our future prospects.
Definitely. I think a big point you also mentioned before the podcast is energy independence as well. When you're using solar versus other forms of energy.
There's a resiliency. There's frankly a national security aspect to distributed generation,
national security
right?
is huge. Yes.
One of the biggest vulnerabilities is our electrical infrastructure because it's, we're being powered by centralized plants. And so having a series of distributed power plants located throughout a given market or region, or even just taking it a step further and having one's home, the roof be comprised of solar shingles. I think that Tesla product, by the way, is awesome. You see that thing?
I have. Yeah.
There's just inherent kind of resiliency that ultimately that provides, as opposed to being subject to the health of the local power grid. And not that that's changing in the next handful of years, because we're going to have wires for many, many years, as we all know to come. But there's a resiliency play that is often, it's not spoken of much in our space.
It's surprising.
It is surprising.
Because everyone is always talking a lot about the ratepayer, but what about the resiliency or some of the other aspects with not having to upgrade the grid when you have solar or other renewables, especially when you talk about storage? I mean, I was impacted by Sandy, and we didn't have power for
weeks, right?
For 2 weeks. And, obviously if you had your self-contained solar and storage, that wouldn't have been an issue. It was because the transmission distribution lines, went out. And so I think it's a big thing that, unfortunately, I guess we as an industry have to do a better job talking about national security and independence. And unfortunately, there hasn't been, many upgrades to the grid. And this is
especially in the Northeast, right?
Especially in the Northeast,
you've got just a really kind of oldest population centers in the country are. You've got aging infrastructure. Again, those wires aren't going anywhere anytime soon. But in the case of a Sandy, I'm not sure that the old solar shingles could have withstood hurricane force winds, but just in a normal outage situation where if your roof was solar, and you had a battery in your garage, right, your car was electric, all three kind of work in concert with one another in tandem. That's compelling, right? As opposed to having your being dark for days. It happens every year with us. I mean, we'll get a bad storm in the summer.
Oh yeah,
it's like
this happens in Virginia, Maryland, DC.
Without fail, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Then I bought a generator for my house.
Oh.
Sold that house. When I bought the generator, the power never went out, so I never got to use it. Now it goes out all the time, and I know if I buy one,
it's Murphy's Law.
It's Murphy's Law. Exactly.
No, I understand. Yeah, definitely.
I need the battery. I got to get the battery in the house.
Yeah.
I can't go the natural gas generator. That'd be blasphemous.
Yeah, that would be blasphemous. But there are plenty of people in the renewable energy industry driving Ford F-150s. So.
Yes. Hey, you got to bring gear. You got to bring gear to the site, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You got to move those panels around somehow.
Seriously. Well, Steve, this has been an amazing interview. If people want to learn more about Summit Ridge or they want to get in contact with you or Summit Ridge, what's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, I think just probably via our website, which is srenergy.com, www.srenergy.com.
Great.
We've got all our contact information there for sure.
Definitely. And I have one more question.
Shoot.
Sorry, I apologize. You obviously raised money for this venture. How was that process? A lot of entrepreneurs go out there and raise money and they weren't successful. Can you?
I raised working capital. Yeah.
Oh, you raised working capital.
Which is the hardest.
That's the hardest
money to raise.
Yeah.
That was. I've got great partners in Aligned Climate Capital, formerly Aligned Intermediary.
Sure.
A guy named Peter Davidson's the head of the shop. He's a good friend of mine, and used to run the loan program office under the Obama administration for a period of time. I got lucky and I had met them some years earlier, and it didn't seem to be the time. It was the right time and the right place with the right folks, and they really helped syndicate the investment. We pulled in multiple investors, which enabled me to kickstart this thing. So in many respects, that is the hardest capital to raise, and that folks are betting on the person or the people and the team, and it's the most at risk, right? Because it's, what did he say at the time, which was I'll never forget. It was, he said, you don't invest in Broadway shows, restaurants, or solar devcos.
That's pretty funny.
But I'm going to invest in you this time. So
yeah.
It was, it's like any development shop. It's a chance, but it was something I felt really strongly about. When I left my previous employer, it was kind of the cleanest, clearest decision I knew was right, and I knew what I wanted to do, and it came together. So, but not without its challenges. I would recommend it though to the right folks at the right time. If it feels right, you got to go for it. You never know.
You
gotta. If the desire is to go off and start your own thing, you go around this thing once, right?
Yeah, and you don't want to have the regret. Right?
Absolutely,
that's the worst part.
And I had Sun Edison never kind of collapsed the way it did in kind of spectacular fashion. I'd probably still be there, right? Because there was a time when things were Anyway, debatable.
Definitely.
I may not have done this though. So
Sure. Yeah, with life you never know, and it seemed like that everything seemed to align at that point, and that's great to hear about your story. And it's congratulations on obviously the Maryland projects that are coming online, and then obviously you talked a little bit about how you're gonna be investing in and owning your projects going forward. Those are huge.
Basis, yeah, we'll have more on that soon. We'll be making a kind of an announcement in the next several weeks, but exciting times.
Yeah, definitely.
Proud of my team here at Summit Ridge. We've managed to do okay since we started, which in this space is it's not the easiest thing. So
definitely, it's pretty impressive as someone who's been in the industry for a while.
Thanks, man.
It's been pretty impressive. So thank you again for your time today. To learn more about Summit Ridge, again, as Steve said, go to srenergy.com. We'll actually have it as well in the notes. And thank you again.
Thanks, Benoy. Appreciate it.
We hope to have you or even Garen on the podcast as well. Thank you, Garen, for setting this up.
Anytime.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. If this content is delivering value to you, please go to iTunes and Stitcher Radio and leave us a 5-star review. That helps us build this community, and that's what we're all about right now. Building this community as big as we can to deliver as much value as we can.